By design, Scorn is confusing, repulsing, and unsettling. It's a psychosexual, biomechanical world full of detail and unambiguous imagery that lacks any explicit explanation. Between its two playable characters, there is not a single line of spoken or written dialogue. The entire world appears abandoned, save for ruins and dangerous monsters, and the only clues to a grander purpose lay in Scorn's environment and player actions. And those dark, dusty, and dim environments, especially when paired with Scorn's excellent sound design, make for an uncanny and intoxicating game to be lost in. This, too, is by design. Thematically, and through its art direction, Scorn famously imitates, if not at least resembles, the works of H.R. Giger, Zdzisław Beksiński, Harlan Ellison, and J.G. Ballard. The color palettes and art styles of Giger and Beksiński specifically, artists whose work has been propped up by multiple games in recent years, are not only recognizable, but references to specific works of theirs, intentional or not, can be spotted throughout. Scorn's barren desert, a phenomenal moment of exploration and mystery, practically has you walking through a Beksiński landscape. The gory, faceless enemies you encounter appear slightly similar to Beksiński's bloodied and bandaged crawling creature, as well as some concept art Giger did for Alien. And of course, the in-universe art and architecture, specifically closer to Scorn's ending, sprout from Giger's erotic biomechanical mosaics. With these inspirations in mind, building a narrative, I assume, was a challenge for ebb Software, specifically on how clear an explanation to give the world. This is not to say that Scorn completely mirrors the meaning of its artistic inspirations and doesn't find any meaning of its own, because I believe it does. Beksiński famously avoided giving his work concrete explanations. He didn't even give his work titles. Giger, on the other hand, did have some explicit reasons behind his work. One of my personal favorites, Shaft 7 from 1966, was inspired by Giger's intrigue and fear of underground passages in Kerr, Switzerland, his hometown. As a game, Scorn works from a basic survival horror formula. Health and ammo are precious and only refilled at stations thinly spread throughout the world, and those stations are usually emptied after a single use. It's a perfectly adequate system, necessitating and rewarding skillful resource management that is severely bogged down by some pretty awkward combat. Enemies have both melee and ranged attacks, both of which Scorn's slow movement makes tricky to dodge. The first weapon you get, a kind of pneumatic puncher, has to recharge after 2 punches, usually not enough to end combat. And whether or not you're in range to do some punching can be difficult to tell as well. Once you have ranged weapons, combat becomes a little easier, but Scorn doesn't have an option to lessen the camera's sensitivity while you aim, which makes aiming difficult and missed shots really frustrating. I resort to avoiding combat as much as I can, usually just by running away at the first sign of enemies and waiting until they disappear into tunnels or walls, which is actually an effective, if tedious, way of getting around combat. It's all a very strange misstep that results in some seriously disruptive speed bumps in what is otherwise a solid horror game. Why Scorn is called Scorn, I'm not entirely sure. It could be a reference to the attitude of its two main characters, the host and parasite, or more generally a reference to Scorn's biomechanical body horror. Decoding Scorn is difficult because, while it does have a story, there are details that seem deliberately made to throw you off from deeper investigation. There are multiple types of humanoid creatures in Scorn, but finding consistencies between their appearances and portrayals is tricky. Our two playable characters have no mouth, some kind of gills or lungs on their chest, and both are born from a cliffside wall in the desert. At the beginning of the game, a creature fused with an egg, as well as bodies found throughout, have different features, like a thin horizontal mouth and more human-like chests. Near the end, we find even more beings. Again, mouthless, but preserved in giant, idealized, erotic statues with a few bodies left in ritualistic crucifixion poses. But then there's this guy. The character at Scorn's main menu, unbeknownst to first-time players, is a mutated parasite, their mouth apparently cracked or broken. Scorn starts by cutting back and forth between two scenes. In one, the parasite wakes up and breaks away from its encasement. In the other, a character crawls through a desert toward a tower before falling into a pit. These two visions are actually the same character at different points in time. We begin the game as the parasite, but before they've been heavily injured and mutated. The mutation is a result of an explosion at the end of Act 1 that submerges the character in some kind of fluid. To the point, initially, I assumed this damage was caused by the explosion. The host, the second playable character, is born from the cliffside wall and dropped into the same desert from the beginning, and we get to see what the host looks like at the end of the game. The bodies surrounding the cliff all appeared to have the same, if not extremely similar, bone structures. It would make sense if the parasite, at least initially, looked like the host since each shared a common birth. However, late in the game, we can see a sculpture with a striking resemblance to the parasite's face, indicating that the parasite is actually not unique. What does this all mean? It could mean a lot of things. It could mean that these beings don't experience time linearly, so they know of the first character's skull. And it could be an art asset that was reused because these big mosaics, while beautiful, also took forever to make. As we said, decoding Scorn, while fun, is tricky, and I think there's more to say about what Scorn means rather than the details of its world and what precisely happens. But it is useful to know what happens. While Scorn technically has 5 acts, I think the game can be split into 3 parts. Part 1, the first hour or so, the parasite, before being turned, makes their way through what appears to be some kind of factory. A factory that uses bodies to apparently feed or otherwise nurture a giant tree. That tree, for whatever reason, explodes, and our main character is submerged, presumably by the liquefied remains of the beings we saw before, and becomes what we see at the main menu. It's not explicitly revealed until much later, during one of the most skin-crawling scenes I've ever seen in a game, that the character from the main menu becomes a hideous parasite. With part 2, another character is born, and this time we get a brilliant walk through Scorn's gorgeously morbid desert, leading to the factory. A lot happens during this middle section, and inside this factory, our main character encounters the parasite and is ensnared by it, becoming its host. Part 2 also reveals that the world is seemingly dying, disintegrating away piece by piece, while strange monsters have invaded and begun consuming the walls and rooms of the factory. These monsters are disturbingly minimalistic. They have no obvious eyes or ears, pale skin, and red innards that they use to coalesce with others and create massive dead strands. As the game progresses, the parasite periodically takes more control of the host's body, forcefully shoving its hands into the host's abdomen. After some combat and puzzling, the host encounters the Brood Mother, a visual that is as spectacular as it is horrifying. It's unclear if the Brood Mother is related to the monsters consuming the world, but visual evidence strongly suggests so. Her hands are similar to the monsters, and on her back, newborns are attempting to break free. Unfortunately, progress requires that you go up, using an elevator beneath the Brood Mother. As you ascend, the Brood Mother is ripped from her nest and writhes in pain. Walking away, we can see the Brood Mother in the distance, alive but clearly injured. A tram takes the host to Part 3, Scorn's final level. It's a temple adorned with erotic statues and detailed mosaics. Interestingly, this is the first time Scorn shows us signs of culture. Beforehand, sexual imagery was definitely suggested, but the factory, while stylized, is functional, crude, and plain. At the temple, the art direction transitions Scorn's sexuality from suggestive to explicit, from visceral to ornate. We see the same birthing machines at the temple that we saw at the factory, but the surrounding culture indicates reverence. Sex and procreation are an important part of these beings' identity. Inside the temple, the parasite grows its tendrils so far the host can no longer use its hands and must stab itself to force the parasite to retract. A crude claw machine allows the host to remove the parasite, though by no small protest from the parasite. Afterward, the host endures a brutal medical procedure, their brain is joined with others through some kind of organic network, and their consciousness is transported into new bodies. The host carries its older body out of the temple toward a portal, but is unable to reach it before the parasite attacks them once again, and this time, the two are joined, forming what appears to be a new tree, similar to the one that exploded in Part 1 and made the parasite in the first place. What I see in Scorn is a cynical, terrifying short story about exploitation, class division, and the fragility of identity and self-awareness. Both characters are born unceremoniously and head from their birth straight to the factory. Now, calling this area a factory is putting a thumb on the scale because, like everything else in Scorn, there is no explicit explanation behind what the building is or is meant for. But inside, we see cranes, hooks, railways, trolleys, and other industrial machines. The first weapon you get, the pneumatic puncher, is like an organic demolition hammer. Around the factory, you can also find other skeletons similar to the ones near the birth wall, implying other beings like yourself operated the factory. In each place, we could be seeing a division of class: a lower class used for sustenance, a worker class used to operate the machinery, and an upper class separated by a tram atop an elevator enjoying the spoils of culture, art, and procreation. For Scorn, it's a cynical picture of existence, from birth to factory worker, perhaps sustaining the higher class that lives around the temple. We can see a similar cynicism in Giger's work, specifically his birth machine, this one from 1967. Children fired out of a gun armed with a gun of their own into an inhospitable world. The 1960s, of course, being a time of uncertainty under the possibility of nuclear destruction. Giger's first iteration of birth machine, drawn in 1965, appeared much more organic and womb-like. The key you get to operate consoles is violently attached to your character's hand, becoming a new part of their body. Not just a tool, but a tool set into your arm. Where sex and reproduction are revered by the upper class, for workers, their job maintaining procreation is imposed upon them and becomes a part of their physical identity. Cynical or not, birth and death, exploitation, and the extension of the self are central recurring themes in Scorn. Interactions and new items are often integrated by way of becoming an extension of the character, changing them physically and enhancing their abilities. Even consoles for doors and puzzles look more like the character is just flexing the muscles in their arm rather than using controls. The parasite is also an extension. After it attaches itself to the host effectively has 4 arms. Weapons are connected to the parasite's tail, and it also makes for a grisly inventory screen. At Scorn's end, the host is unable to escape and is forcefully merged with the parasite into something new. Life in Scorn is seemingly totally based around violent exploitation. Even at the temple, the host has to crush and use the blood of smaller beings to fuel its next bodies, but only after they fight to defend themselves. Another possible way to read Scorn's 3 parts is as a broader procession of life. The desert is primordial. Life literally emerges from the earth, or whatever planet Scorn is on, and is set in motion. It then adapts to its environment, or adapts the environment to it in order to continue growing. At the factory, procreation is basic and mechanical. Eventually, civilization emerges, more than just survival, but self-awareness, culture, and society. And through this, life distances itself from other, more feral and animalistic forms of life, if not at least relatively speaking. Herein, I think we can find the true terror of Scorn. Of our 2 playable characters, we see almost the entirety of both their lives, from birth until they're joined. What these beings' motivations are is an interesting question because we can't entirely be sure the playable characters in Scorn are self-aware. What guides players through Scorn are common video game languages, linearity, locked doors, and button prompts. We know these are the paths we're supposed to take and the objects we're supposed to interact with, but there's no indication our character is necessarily following anything but instinct. Whether the host's species is self-aware, gained self-awareness after years of abandonment, or working completely on instinct, the result is still nightmarish. Being on the precipice of evolution, steps away from the next stage in development, right before being captured and consumed back into the natural world. Humans have risen above our natural origins, gained individuality and self-awareness, and balanced those with primal desires and fears, like sex and the fear of being eaten, itself which can be traced all the way back to at least 1979. The idea of regression, of being alive but returning to insentience, of losing individuality and all that we've gained after centuries of development is terrifying.